The first time Claire saw him, she felt something unfamiliar twist in her chest. Something she didn't have a name for yet. Something she didn't expect to feel toward the groom whose wedding she'd agreed to stand as a bridesmaid. It happened the moment Ethan walked into the rehearsal dinner, carrying 2 extra chairs because the venue staff had forgotten them, laughing with a warmth that seemed to settle into the room like sunlight. Claire had heard of him long before that moment, of course, because Rachel, her best friend since childhood, had spent months telling her how perfect Ethan was. She'd described how kind he was, how thoughtful, how exactly the man she'd always dreamed of marrying. Claire had nodded, smiled, listened, and believed her, until she actually met him, and something shifted, something she wished she could have stopped. It felt like betrayal, even though she hadn't done anything wrong. Not yet. The wedding was in 10 days, just 10, and Claire promised herself nothing would happen, nothing could happen, nothing should happen. But the universe loves irony, and forbidden stories have a way of writing themselves even when no one wants to pick up the pen. It started subtly, too subtly for her to notice at first, and she blamed exhaustion and the stress of helping plan a wedding Rachel had dreamed of for years. But then came the little things that made lying to herself harder, the things that didn't feel accidental anymore. There was the way Ethan sought her out during group conversations, as if her presence grounded him. The way he listened to her comments like they meant something more than casual chatter. The way he smiled at her, really smiled, in that slow, almost bewildered way someone smiles when they recognize a person they didn't know they needed. She tried to ignore it, and tried even harder to ignore what it stirred inside her. But ignoring it was like ignoring a splinter. Relief didn't come from pretending it wasn't there. Relief only came from facing the pain, and she wasn't ready to. The first real moment, the moment she should have walked away from, came on the 3rd day after she arrived in town. Rachel had sent her to the venue with Ethan to pick up fabric samples for the table settings. A simple errand meant to be quick and uncomplicated. But the sky had other plans, because a storm rolled over the hills out of nowhere, flooding the parking lot while they were inside. The thunder shook the old building, the kind of rattling rumble that echoed through the floors. And when the power flickered, Claire instinctively grabbed Ethan's arm. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't intentional, it was fear, pure instinct. But the moment her hand wrapped around him, Ethan turned toward her. His expression softened instead of tensing, as though he was the one being steadied, and she pulled back quickly, mumbling an apology. He simply laughed, not mocking, but gentle, reassuring, warm, and that warmth stayed with her long after the storm passed. Later, in the car, as rain hammered the windshield, Ethan said something she wasn't prepared for. "Claire, can I tell you something weird?" he asked, and her stomach tightened before she answered. When he admitted he felt complicated, she forced herself to stay detached, to interpret it the way any rational friend would, and she asked if it was cold feet. "Maybe," he said, "but not in the way people talk about it." And Claire's pulse thudded in her throat as he tried to explain feelings that neither of them should have been discussing. She stared out the window, pretending to watch the streaks of water, pretending she didn't feel the weight of a confession that wasn't meant to be about her, but felt too close. She told him everyone gets nervous, and he nodded, though she knew her reassurance hadn't landed. The next days made everything worse, or better, or both. She couldn't tell anymore. At fittings, Ethan always ended up near her, and at rehearsals he asked her opinion almost as often as he asked Rachel's. At night, Claire found herself thinking about him in ways she had no right to, reminding herself again and again that he wasn't hers, shouldn't be hers, could never be hers. But wanting isn't rational, and wanting doesn't listen to reason or guilt or loyalty. It just is, even when the timing is cruel and the consequences inevitable. 7 days before the wedding, something changed. They were at Rachel's parents' house sorting childhood photos to display at the reception, and Rachel stepped away to take a call from the florist. That left Claire and Ethan alone in a living room full of boxes. Ethan picked up a photo of Claire and Rachel in elementary school, covered in mud after playing outside, and he smiled as he turned it slowly in his hands. "You two have known each other forever," he said, and Claire nodded, telling him since they were 5. "You're lucky," he murmured, his eyes still on the picture. "Friendships like that don't come around often." Claire replied quietly, "Neither do good relationships." And when he looked up at her, meeting her eyes with a depth that felt too intentional, something in the room shifted. Neither of them looked away, and neither of them spoke about what they both felt, but refused to acknowledge. Rachel returned minutes later, cheerful and oblivious, while Claire struggled to steady her breathing and Ethan pretended nothing had happened. After that, Claire tried to avoid him. She volunteered for errands that kept her away and made excuses to leave events early, texting instead of calling, anything to create distance. But fate or chance or something more stubborn kept pushing them back together. At the cake tasting, the seating rehearsal, the meeting with the photographer. Everywhere she turned, there he was. A gravitational force she couldn't escape, no matter how desperately she pretended otherwise. 3 days before the wedding, everything unraveled, and it started with a midnight phone call. Claire had been tossing in bed, unable to sleep through the whirlwind of thoughts weighing on her, when her phone rang. She assumed it was Rachel, who often called late during moments of wedding panic, but the name on the screen was Ethan's. Her heart kicked against her ribs, and she stared at it long enough to consider ignoring it. But she didn't. She picked up, and his tired voice whispered, "Sorry, I know it's late." He asked if she could meet him, and though she hesitated, she broke the moment he said, "Please." They met at the edge of the Old Town Park, quiet and dim under a low-hanging moon, and Ethan looked emotionally drained. "I think I'm making a mistake," he said immediately, and Claire froze where she stood. She tried to tell him he was nervous like anyone would be, but he shook his head, saying the feeling wasn't nerves but something deeper. She told him to talk to Rachel, but he said he couldn't, not until he understood what was happening inside him. Claire stepped back, fear curling through her. "Ethan, what does that mean?" she whispered. When he looked at her with an expression she wasn't ready for, he told her, "I think I know why everything feels wrong. I think I know what's been pulling me off course." She begged him not to say it, but he did. "It's you." The world tilted, and Claire shook her head hard, her pulse hammering as she insisted he was overwhelmed and confused. Ethan disagreed gently but firmly, telling her he'd been fighting it since they met, hoping it would fade, but it only grew stronger each day. She stepped back into the damp grass, her voice trembling as she told him she cared about Rachel and would never cross that line. Ethan nodded, saying that was why it hurt, because she was good, because she wouldn't let something happen. Her chest tightened painfully. She told him they couldn't let this exist, couldn't let it go anywhere, and he nodded again with a crack in his voice that made her want to break. She looked away, blinking hard against her own emotions, and told him to forget this, to go home, that tomorrow would look different. He didn't argue. He walked away, and Claire stayed until he disappeared before letting herself crumble. The next day was agony. Rachel was glowing, excited, thrilled, talking nonstop about wedding details with pure joy. And every word stabbed Claire, who tried to smile and tried to match her energy while her chest felt like it was closing. She kept replaying Ethan's confession, trying to erase it, trying to convince herself she'd misunderstood somehow. But she hadn't. And that truth terrified her in ways she couldn't admit to anyone, least of all herself. 2 days before the wedding, Claire decided she needed to talk to Ethan one last time, not to encourage anything, but to shut it down once and for all. To draw a line neither of them could cross. She found him alone in the venue courtyard adjusting decorations, and when he looked up and saw her, something in his expression shifted, as if he'd been hoping she would come. Claire didn't let him speak. "Whatever you think you feel," she said firmly, "you have to let it go, right now." Ethan looked stunned, then frustrated, trying to speak, but she cut him off with sharp finality. "No," she said. "Listen, Rachel loves you. She believes in you. She's planning a life with you, and I'm not going to be the reason any of that falls apart." Ethan tried to protest, insisting he was the one who, but she didn't let him finish. "It doesn't matter," she said. "It stops here. It has to." Ethan stepped closer, but stopped halfway, his voice rough as he admitted he didn't want to hurt Rachel and never wanted this. But pretending he didn't feel something real didn't make it disappear. Claire exhaled shakily and told him he didn't have to pretend. He just had to choose, and that the choice was already made. Ethan looked down, his jaw tight and his hands clenched at his sides. After a long moment, he whispered, "You're right. I know you're right." Claire nodded, feeling both relieved and devastated, whispering, "Good, because this ends now." Ethan nodded again, but the look in his eyes said it wasn't that simple, said the ending she demanded wasn't one his heart could accept easily, no matter how hard he tried. The day before the wedding, everything broke. It happened during the final rehearsal, with the officiant walking everyone through the order of the ceremony and arranging people where they needed to stand. Claire ended up beside Ethan, just as she dreaded, and she kept her eyes forward, refusing to look at him even though she felt the tension radiating from him like a storm. When Rachel walked down the aisle for practice, glowing with anticipation, Claire's chest tightened painfully at the sight. It hurt because she loved Rachel deeply, because she loved Ethan in a way she shouldn't, and because she had never wanted to be the villain in anyone's life. When the officiant asked them to rehearse their vows, Rachel giggled nervously as she took Ethan's hands. Claire looked away, pretending to fix a flower arrangement, but she heard it, the crack in Ethan's voice, not from emotion for Rachel, but something else. Something he struggled desperately to hide from the world. After rehearsal, Rachel asked Claire to help her check the reception hall, and Claire agreed quickly, craving distance from Ethan. But halfway there, Rachel's phone rang and she stepped outside to take the call, leaving Claire alone in the decorated room with twinkling lights and soft echoes of celebration. Claire breathed slowly, trying to steady herself, when she heard footsteps approaching. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Ethan stepped inside, conflicted and tense. "I thought you were with Rachel," Claire said without turning. "She's on the phone." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, until Ethan said quietly, "I don't think I can do this." Claire spun around as he clarified. He meant it, really meant it. And he'd been pushing everything down, but every time he looked at her, something in him felt wrong and right at the same time. Claire pressed her hands to her temples, begging him to stop, insisting he had to. But Ethan stepped closer and asked, "Do you feel nothing?" Claire froze, telling him not to do that, but he asked again, his voice barely controlled. Tears burned her eyes as she shook her head and whispered that it didn't matter what she felt, that it couldn't matter. Ethan's jaw clenched, and he whispered, "So you do." Claire said nothing, because saying nothing was the only thing that kept the world from shattering. Before anything else could be said, Rachel walked back in smiling brightly, unaware of the emotional wreckage she'd stepped between. Ethan moved away instantly, putting space between them. Claire wiped her eyes fast, pretending everything was normal, while Rachel talked about table placements and music choices. Claire hated herself for holding a secret she never wanted to hold, for standing in the middle of a heartbreak no one asked for. That night, Claire didn't sleep. She paced the guest room, her mind spinning with impossible questions. Could she stop a wedding? Should she? Would telling Rachel destroy everything? Would silence destroy her? At sunrise, she finally sat on the bed, hollow and exhausted, whispering to herself, "This isn't my story. I don't get to decide how it ends." And the truth in those words settled deep in her bones like resignation and courage woven together. The hours before the wedding blurred past in color and laughter. Makeup, hair, dresses, and Rachel glowing with excitement. Claire did her best to pretend, to smile, to support, but inside everything was splintering quietly. She slipped outside 20 minutes before the ceremony to breathe, needing a moment of air before she broke apart. But she heard footsteps again, soft and hesitant, and she closed her eyes because she already knew who it was. Ethan looked as wrecked as she felt. "Claire," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." She shook her head instantly, saying, "Not today." Ethan insisted today was exactly why he had to say it. She pleaded with him not to, but he looked at her with a rawness she wasn't ready for and said, "I'm in love with you." Claire's breath caught as pain rushed through her. Pure, sharp, devastating. "Why would you say that now?" she whispered. Ethan said he needed her to know the truth, even if nothing came of it. even if he walked down that aisle. He needed her to know. Claire stepped toward him, tears slipping down her cheeks as she whispered, "You're breaking me." Ethan said he didn't want to hurt her, but he couldn't pretend anymore. She closed her eyes, wishing desperately she could undo everything, then opened them and steadied her voice. "You have to marry Rachel," she said. Ethan stared at her, anguish carved across his face, and asked, "Why?" Claire swallowed hard and told him the truth. Because Rachel loved him, because she chose him, because she deserved the life she dreamed of, because their connection, whatever it was, could never be worth Rachel's heartbreak. Ethan swallowed as she said it, each word pushing them farther apart. "And what about us?" he asked. Claire forced a trembling smile and whispered, "We don't exist." "Not like that." Tears slid down Ethan's cheek, and Claire reached up, gently wiping them away with her thumb, a touch that was both tender and final. "Go," she whispered, "before this becomes harder than it already is." Ethan nodded slowly, painfully, then turned and walked back inside, leaving Claire standing alone in the quiet. The ceremony was beautiful, the vows heartfelt, the guests cried. Rachel and Ethan kissed, sealing a promise he would honor because that was who he was. Claire stood beside her best friend, smiling through the ache, holding flowers while her heart cracked in slow, silent pieces. She survived the ceremony, the reception, the send-off, all with grace she didn't know she possessed. The story didn't end with the wedding. It ended 10 hours later, after all the guests were gone and the music faded, after Rachel and Ethan drove away toward their honeymoon. Claire sat alone outside the venue, staring at rows of empty chairs and petals scattered across the ground. She felt hollow and exhausted, but strangely peaceful. Not because she'd lost something, but because she'd protected something far bigger than herself. Sometimes love isn't about having someone. Sometimes it's about letting go with grace. As the moon climbed high and the world fell silent, Claire whispered, "Maybe in another life." She rose slowly, brushed the grass from her dress, and walked toward a future she didn't understand yet, but one she was finally ready to face. The ache lingered, deep and real, but so did the strength she gained from choosing the harder path. A path that proved love can be complicated, painful, forbidden, and still breathtakingly true. In the end, Claire didn't get the groom, but she got something else, something that mattered just as much. She discovered that sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones that end with a kiss. They're the ones that end with a choice.